There's something about PS1 JRPGs that keeps me coming back to them, and based on the number of remasters and ports we've seen in the past few years, I'm not the only one. As I've mentioned previously on this channel, I didn't even really get into JRPGs until late in the next generation, so I didn't get a chance to play most of these games during their initial release. When I did get hooked on JRPGs and went looking for recommendations on what the best and most important games were, almost everyone pointed me to a PS1 game. Now I look at the PS1 as the console where many of my favorite games were released to, and where many of my favorite franchises got their start. Today I'd like to share what are, in my opinion, the 10 best or most important PS1 JRPGs. Just a couple of quick notes before I get started. This is not an ordered list. My opinions on which games I like better than the others changes frequently, so this list is more in random order than any kind of solid ranking. And I can only rank games I've finished, so games that have been recommended or picked up but haven't yet played or haven't completed won't appear here. While I continue my Sisyphean task of playing every worthwhile JRPG ever, there continues to only be so many hours in the day. With that out of the way, here's my top 10. Final Fantasy Tactics. I'm not typically a fan of tactical RPGs. When it comes to carefully planning my movements and actions, my brain not work so good. But I absolutely love Final Fantasy Tactics. The Final Fantasy job system is at its best in large formations with lots of characters to experiment with. The battles are deep enough to keep you on your toes, but not so hard to be inaccessible to those with little experience in the genre. What really causes Tactics to withstand the test of time is its story. It features a mature and grounded story, realistically flawed and sympathetic characters, and some of the best world building of any JRPG I've ever played. As a big fan of the fantasy genre, this story of war, politics, and conspiracy scratches an itch that is usually only satisfied by novels. The game was remastered and enhanced as Final Fantasy Tactics War of the Lions for the PSP, which is without a question the best way to play it currently. It was also ported to the phone, though that version has some mixed reviews. Valkyrie Profile. When I was getting started out in JRPGs, I saw them sort of as power fantasies, like playable anime. Sure, many of them had dark tones and tragic moments, but at the end of the day, as long as I was mowing through monsters with a giant sword, I was happy. Valkyrie Profile really redefined for me what a JRPG was capable of. Never before had a game tugged on my emotions the way this game did. Normally, I'm excited about recruiting party members, but each new character requiring you to watch a tragic cutscene about the circumstances of their death, it hits a little different. Meanwhile, if you go down the route of the true ending, and you explore more of the protagonist Lyneth's origins, actually I don't want to spoil too much in case any of you are interested in picking it up for the first time. Gameplay-wise, it's a solid and unique experience, mixing platforming and puzzle solving with time and resource management, so you have to make decisions about which characters to keep in your party, and which to send to Valhalla to fight in a looming war. While there are certainly games since then that have hit me harder emotionally, I'm looking at you, Nier. I think Valkyrie Profile's symbolism and style causes it to hold up pretty well to this day. Like a lot of games on this list, it received an enhanced version for the PSP called Valkyrie Profile Lyneth, and that version was actually recently ported to the PS4 and PS5, so now would be a good time for new players to pick up this gem. It shall be engraved upon your soul. Star Ocean, the second story. Anyone who watched my last video on Star Ocean First Departure will not be surprised to see this on the list. I love the classic Star Ocean games, and many would argue that Second Story is the best in the entire franchise. Everything that was great about First Departure, Second Story takes to the next level. You now have the option of two player characters, both of whom have their own perspectives, which will impact the story and the possible endings, in addition to decisions made throughout the game such as which characters you recruit into your party. Private actions return and are more important, as the impact felt in the characters' relationships are greater. The story is told better and the world building is deeper, and there's a ridiculous 86 different versions of the ending. Mechanically, it's very similar to First Departure, which is unsurprising since First Departure is actually a remake of the first Star Ocean game using a modified version of Second Story's engine, but that's not a bad thing by any stretch. If you enjoy settings that combine heroic fantasy and sci-fi, and early action battle systems, you're bound to enjoy Second Story. As is becoming a running theme, this game would receive an enhanced remaster for the PSP, called Star Ocean Second Evolution. Unfortunately, the PS4 version, which included enhanced graphics, was never released outside of Japan for no apparent reason. Final Fantasy IX. Okay, time to get a little controversial. All three of the PS1 mainline Final Fantasy games deserve a place on this list. but since I already knew I was including tactics, and I didn't want nearly half a list to be dominated by Final Fantasy, I decided I had to pick just one, and I settled on Final Fantasy IX. Feel free to imagine I picked Final Fantasy VII, or Final Fantasy VIII for those 5 of you who prefer it. But for me, Final Fantasy IX is the one I always want to go back to. Its colorful aesthetic, high fantasy setting, and whimsical character design are just a pleasure to experience. The story does get surprisingly dark at points, but it never becomes pessimistic, and I think that's why I enjoy it so much. You could argue about which game has the best version of the active time battle system, or the best character progression, or the most memorable bosses, but the positive tones, likable cast, and warm fantasy soundtrack makes 9 more of a joy to play, at least to me. It makes me wish we got more JRPGs with that medieval-inspired, high fantasy aesthetic. FF9 has a remastered version that's available on all modern consoles and PC, although these are ports of the mobile version, so your mileage may vary. Xenogears. I recently completed my first ever playthrough of Xenogears. Those of you who watched my review of the game might be surprised that I'm putting it on this list. But while I had a few criticisms, particularly about the game, not being finished, its ambition alone earns it a place on this list. It features one of the most epic, if not the most epic, story in JRPG history, a ridiculous amount of world building, expansive character development, along with a unique take on the turn-based battle system that has players inputting combos to do special attacks. Also, giant mech fights. While it's a bit clunky and the second disc turns into a visual novel, it's nonetheless an important game to play if you have the time and patience for it. Unfortunately, unlike other entries on this list, it seems unlikely that Xenogears will receive a remaster or port anytime soon, so right now, unless you want to dish out almost $100 to get a PS1 copy, emulation is your only option. Check out my full review if you want to see more of my take on this unique piece of JRPG history. Suikoden. I like big parties. I like recruiting lots of unique characters. If you give me a game with a huge cast of recruitable characters, chances are I'm going to have a pretty good time, and no series does big parties like Suikoden. With 6-person parties and over 100 recruitable characters, it gives you a lot of options to experiment with when devising strategies and formations for the turn-based battle system. Combined with the strategic war battles, you really feel like you're building a force for tackling an empire. The series also features some of the deepest world building of any JRPG franchise, with a lot of thought given to the world's politics, history, and magic system. It can be a little tough for new players to wrap their heads around, but once you get into it, exploring the world and trying to recruit every character you can becomes super addictive. Most fans would agree that Suikoden 2 is the better game, and I wouldn't necessarily disagree. I only decided to put the original on the list out of respect for it spawning the franchise. Fortunately, Konami has said, why not both? And we'll be releasing remasters of both packaged together later this year. Wild Arms. One setting I feel is underutilized in the JRPG space is the Western, which makes sense. Japanese developers won't have the same attachment to Western folklore as us, but it sure is nice when one of them decides to take a crack at it. I picked up Wild Arms on a recommendation and didn't know what to expect. I was immediately taken in by the spaghetti Western-inspired soundtrack, the world design, and masterful sprite work, though the early 3D polygonal models in the battle system did not age quite as well. One of the standout mechanics of this game, and one I'm surprised we don't see more often, is how unique each of the 3 protagonists are in terms of abilities, not only in their battle system, but also their tools for puzzle solving, which has them at points splitting up to use those tools. Wild Arms as a franchise has basically been dead since the PS2 era, not counting ports and mobile games, which is sad. It might not have the same sales power as some of the big hitters, but these games offered something unique in the JRPG space. If you're interested in picking up the original, it has been ported to the PS4 and PS5 as part of the revamped PS Plus service. Vagrant Story. Another game set in Ivalice, the same setting as Final Fantasy Tactics, one of my favorite JRPG settings overall. Vagrant Story is more of a dungeon crawler than a traditional JRPG, with the player controlling a single character as they explore, solve puzzles, and do some platforming, which means early 3D map navigation, which we all know I'm such a huge fan of. Thankfully, the game is saved by its focus on weapon creation and upgrades, and its take on real-time combat, which sees the player pausing to select which body part to attack, and chaining attacks to activate powerful chain abilities in a way that kinda resembles a rhythm game. There are no NPCs to interact with. The story is told entirely through cutscenes using the same character models as the gameplay, allowing it to switch seamlessly between gameplay and events, or well, as seamlessly as things got in the PS1 era. I don't know if it's just my bias for Ivalice Alliance games that causes me to hold in such high regard, because I've certainly been much harsher to other games with less jank, but there's something about Vagrant Story's look and feel that makes me wish we had gotten more of it. A port of this game was made available in the PlayStation Store for PS3 and PSP, but with the sunsetting of those stores, it is becoming a more difficult game to acquire without an emulator. Parasite Eve. Parasite Eve is a game I am surprised to have liked as much as I did. I'm not really a fan of the horror game genre, in part because I'm a giant wimp who is easily startled. So when someone recommended me a game they described as Resident Evil as a JRPG, I really wasn't expecting it to be my cup of tea. Man, was I wrong. To start with, it has what has to be my favorite battle system out of any of the PS1 JRPGs. It uses a variant of the action time battle system which combines it with real-time movement and dodging. There's a lot of tension to try to avoid getting hit while your ATB bar fills, all the while staying within range of the enemy so that when it comes time, you can quickly target them with an attack. Then there's the plot, which is just completely insane. It starts with everyone at an opera suddenly spontaneously combusting, and only gets weirder from there. It's also nice to occasionally see a JRPG set in the far-off fancy land of New York City. It's not much on the jump scares, thankfully for me, but if you're a fan of Resident Evil for its atmosphere, you'll find a lot to like here. There are some genuinely disturbing cutscenes for what they were able to do with the PS1 hardware. Unfortunately, this is another game where the only ports were to the PlayStation Store for the older consoles, so you may once again be turning to the emulator for this one. Tales of Destiny. There had to be at least one representative of the Tales franchise on this list. Tales of Symphonia is the game I credit with getting me hooked on JRPGs, so of course it was the first franchise I went looking into to play much more of. The first game we got here in the West, Tales of Destiny, remains one of the best regarded to this day. Its take on the linear battle system was the gold standard of action battle systems for the entire generation. It feels surprisingly responsive and impactful compared to many of its contemporaries, and the art style lends itself really well to the animations. As far as story is concerned, it's pretty bog standard at the surface. Country boy leaves home, seeking fame and fortune, finds a talking sword, gets himself embroiled in an epic quest with the fate of the world at stake. It's nothing groundbreaking, but it's solid, paced well, and has some genuinely memorable moments. There's nothing wrong with doing something simple, but doing it well. Also, the talking swords are called Swordians, which is just the best name for them. Unfortunately, the West never received the PS2 Director's Cut of Destiny, nor did we get its direct sequel, as the Tales of Destiny 2 we got in America is actually Tales of Eternia, so if there's one thing 90s Japanese developers loved, it was confusing Americans. I dream of one day getting a remastered collection featuring both Destiny and Destiny 2. Bandai Namco has done some re-releases of other titles, so maybe one day that dream will come true. That's my list. Feel free to yell at me in the comments about which of your favorite JRPGs didn't make it, or for me not having played Chrono Cross yet, or whatever else you feel like. If you've watched this far, you're probably a fan of the JRPG genre, so why don't you check out our Short Skits series where we have fun poking at JRPG tropes. I'm also always looking for new game recommendations to add to the infinite backlog, so feel free to drop them below. Thanks for watching, see you guys hopefully again real soon.